Welcome to Haunted History Fundamentals. I'm Jeremy, the common historian, and I need to be clear about something right off the start. What I do provide is the historical foundation that makes ghost hunting meaningful. I'm the researcher who digs through archives, verifies claims, and separates documented history with local folklore from local folklore. Before any paranormal investigator even steps foot in a location. And here's what I've learned in my time doing this work. The most terrifying thing in the paranormal research isn't what goes bump in the night. It's how easily misinformation becomes accepted fact. I've seen it happen over and over. Someone experiences something unusual. They search online for an explanation. They find a story, often dramatic, sometimes centuries old, and suddenly the story becomes the truth. No verification, no documentation, just repetition. But here's the thing. If paranormal investigators want to understand genuine phenomenon, they need accurate historical context. And that's where researchers like us come in. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to cover three essential components of paranormal historical research. First, I'll walk you through my methodology for verifying paranormal claims, the same process that I use when preparing research for investigation teams. Second, we'll explore the historical research techniques that actually work, from archives to census records. And third, we'll tackle one of the most misunderstood concepts in this field, the difference between primary and secondary sources, and why it matters when you're investigating a ghost story. By the end of this module, you have a practical framework for approaching any haunted location with the rigor it deserves. Let's get started. So let's talk about verification. When someone tells you a location is haunted, what do you do? Where do you even begin? Over the years, I've developed a three-part methodology that helps me cut through the noise before I even ever provide research to an investigation team. I call it the ORH method, objective data collection, replication, and historical research. Let's break them down by component. The first step is objective data collection. Now, remember, I'm not the one in the field with the equipment, but when I'm preparing research for an investigation team, I want to know, has anyone captured quantifiable data at this location? I ask questions like, have previous investigators used EMF meters to measure electromagnetic fields? Are there high resolution photographs showing visual anomalies? Have digital recorders captured electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, that multiple people have analyzed? Here's the critical part. I'm looking for evidence that exists beyond subjective experiences. Why? Because subjective experiences, while valid to the person having them, can't be verified by anyone else. Someone felt a cold spot. That's noted. But there's a temperature reading. Is there temperature reading to back that up? Someone heard a voice. Important. But is there a recording that others can analyze? This isn't about dismissing people's experiences. It's about building a case that can withstand scrutiny. When I provide research to investigation teams, I want them to have context for what they might capture. And when they do capture something, I want to know how it compares to documented evidence and historical findings. The second component is replication. This is where a lot of paranormal research falls apart. In legitimate scientific research, an experiment must be repeatable. When an investigation team captures an anomaly, I want to know, has this happened before? Have other investigators at different times under similar conditions documented the same phenomenon? Now, I'm not saying paranormal activity operates like a chemistry experiment. We're dealing with phenomenon that, by definition, doesn't follow predictable patterns, but the principle still matters. If a location consistently produces the same type of experience or data across multiple investigations by multiple teams, that's significant. If the phenomenon only happens once to one person with no collaboration, that's an antidote, not evidence. This is why documentation is so important. When investigators work a location, they're creating a record. They know the date, time, weather conditions, equipment used, and exactly what was captured. As a result, I can then compare those findings across different investigations and look for patterns. Here's where my role becomes crucial. I can determine whether those patterns align with historical records. Are investigators reporting Civil War era activity in a building that actually has Civil War connections? Or are they making assumptions based solely on the age of the structure? And that brings us to the third component, historical research. This is the foundation of everything we do in this course, and it's my specialty. Before any investigation team ever sets foot in a supposedly haunted location, I want to provide them with documented history, not the ghost stories, the actual verifiable facts. Who lived there? What happened there? Were there tragedies, significant events, or unusual occurrences that were recorded in official documents? Historical research serves two purposes. First, it provides context for investigators. If team members are reporting Civil War era apparitions in a building, I can tell them, yes, this was actually connected to the Civil War. Here's the documentation. Or I can say, no, despite the building's age, there's no recorded connection to the Civil War. That changes how they interpret their findings. Second, historical research can provide explanations for phenomenon. Sometimes what seems paranormal has a perfectly rational explanation rooted in the location's past. Old buildings settling, hidden rooms create strange acoustics, residual electromagnetic fields from outdated wiring can cause the exact sensation people associate with hauntings. My job is to give the investigators the full picture before they go in, so they can make informed decisions about what they are experiencing. So that's the ORH method. I evaluate what objective data has been previously collected. I look for replication across multiple investigations, and I conduct thorough historical research to provide accurate context. This is the framework I use for every research project, and it's the same framework I recommend you adopt. Not because it guarantees investigators will find ghosts, but because it guarantees that if they do find something, they have the historical foundation to understand it. Now that we understand why historical research matters, let's talk about how to actually do it. Where do you look? What sources are reliable? And how do you access information that might be decades or even centuries old? The good news is we're living in the golden age of historical research. Between digitalized archives, online databases, and local historical societies, there's more information available now than ever before. The bad news, you still need to know where to look and how to evaluate what you find. I use a combination of resources and I recommend you develop a similar toolkit. Let's go through the major categories. First, archives and local libraries. They are your best friends. Most counties and regions have historical archives that house original documents, property deeds, court records, business ledgers, personal correspondence. These are primary sources, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. When I am researching a location, I start by contacting the local historical society or county clerk's office. I explain that what I'm researching and ask what records they have. You'd be surprised at how helpful people are when you approach them professionally and show genuine interest in preserving history. For example, when researching the property at 2424 US Route 11 in Moores, New York, for the Misfits Paranormal Crew, I worked closely with the Clinton County Historical Association. They had property records, newspaper clippings, and even personal accounts from former residents. That information became the foundation of the research package I provided to the team before their investigation. Second, historical newspapers. Newspapers are gold mines for paranormal research because they documented daily life, births, deaths, crimes, accidents, and scandals. If something significant happened at a location, there's a good chance it was covered in the local newspaper. Many newspapers have been digitalized and are searchable through databases like newspaper.com, Chronicling America, and through your local library's digital archives. I spent hours scrolling through microfiche and digital archives tracking down obituaries, property sales, and news stories that give investigation teams the context they need. Third, census records and property records. Census data tells you who lived where, when, and with whom. Property records track ownership, transfers, and sometimes even the physical changes to the building over time. These records are invaluable when you're trying to verify claims like a family of five died in this house in 1890. Okay, show me the census record. Show me the death certificates. Show me the property transfer after the deaths. If those documents don't exist, the story probably doesn't exist either. Fourth, online genealogy databases like Ancestry.com, Family Search, and Find a Grave. These platforms aggregate millions of historical records and make them searchable. If someone mentions a name associated with a haunting, I often can trace that person's entire life, where they were born, who they married, and where they died within minutes. This is incredibly useful when preparing research for investigation teams. If they're going to encounter names or hear claims during their investigation, I want them to already know the documented facts. Finally, don't underestimate the value of local historical societies and regional experts. These are people who've spent decades studying their communities. They know the stories, the families, the forgotten events. They can point you towards resources you'd never find on your own. When I approach these experts, I'm respectful of their time, their expertise. I come prepared with specific questions, and I make it clear that I'm interested in factual history, not sensationalism. That approach has opened doors that would otherwise have stayed closed. Now, there's some important note. Not every source, not every source is created equal. As you research, watch out for red flags, stories that can't be traced to specific sources, claims that appeared on multiple websites but never cite an original document, dates or details that change depending on who's telling the story, local legends that no local historian has ever heard of. If you can't find documented evidence for a claim, it doesn't mean the claim is false, but it does mean you can't present it to an investigation team as historical fact. Let's give Let me give you a real example. Devil's Den Road in Altona, New York. For years, there were rumors of devil-like creatures seen along the roadside. The stories were everywhere, local legend passed down through generations. So I did what I always do. I started digging. I looked at historical records, old maps, settlers' accounts, and what did I find? The name Devil's Den didn't come from supernatural encounters. It came from early settlers who were afraid of the unknown wilderness. They gave ominous names to places that felt dangerous or unfamiliar. That's not an exciting that's not as exciting as demon sightings, but it's the truth. And honestly, I find the real history more interesting. It tells us something about how fear and folklore develop. And it tells investigation teams if you capture something at this location, it's not going to be related to demonic activity because that's not part of the documented history. All right, we've talked about the tools and the techniques. Now let's talk about how to evaluate the information you find. This is where understanding primary versus secondary sources become critical. A primary source is an original document or first-hand account created at the time of the event. Think letters, diaries, photographs, official records, legal documents, newspaper articles from the period. These are sources created by people who were actually there, who witnessed or participated in the events. If you're researching a house from the 1800s, a primary source would be the original property deed, a diary entry from someone who lived there, or a newspaper obituary from that era. Primary sources are as close as you can get to the truth. These are not filtered through someone else's interpretation. They're raw historical data. A secondary source, by contrast, is an interpretation or analysis of a primary source. Think history books, documentaries, websites, even most ghost story collections. These are created by people who weren't there, who are synthesizing information from primary sources, or worse, from other secondary sources. Secondary sources aren't bad. I use them all the time, but they require scrutiny. You need to ask, where did this author get this information? Are they citing primary sources? Or are they just repeating what someone else said? Here's why this distinction matters so much in paranormal research. Most ghost stories are secondary or tertiary or even further removed from the original event. Someone experiences something, they tell a friend. The friend embellishes the story. It gets posted online. Someone else reads it and adds details. 20 years later, the story has morphed into something completely different from what actually happened. I've seen this happen with locations I've researched. The story that that's told today bears almost no resemblance to what the historical records show. But because it's been repeated so many times, people assume it's true. So when you're researching a haunted location, always ask, what's the primary source here? Can I trace this back to the original document or first-hand account? Or is this just folklore that's been passed down, altered over time? Let's give an example from my own work. When I researched 2424 US Route 11 in Morris, New York, for the Misfits paranormal crew, they'd already heard claims about the property's history. My job was to verify those claims before their investigation. I didn't accept what I'd been told. I went to the archives. I found property records, census data, and newspaper articles, and what I discovered confirmed some of the historical claims, added important context to others, and disproved a few entirely. I provided that research to the team before they investigated. So when they captured evidence, when they documented experiences, they had the historical framework to understand what they were dealing with. We weren't just chasing folklore, we were investigating actual documented history. Here's my rule of thumb. If you can't find a primary source to back up a claim, you can mention it as local folklore, but don't present it to investigation teams as historical fact. Be transparent about what you know, what you verified, and what remains unconfirmed. The level of honesty builds credibility, both for you as the researcher and for the investigators you support. And in the field like paranormal research, credibility is everything. All right, let's bring this all together. We've covered a lot in this module. We've started with the ORH method, objective data collection, replication, and historical research. Your framework for verifying paranormal claims and preparing solid research for investigation teams. We've explored the historical research techniques that actually work: archives, newspapers, census records, property documents, and invaluable help of local historians. And we've distinguished between primary and secondary sources and why that distinction is critical when you're trying to separate fact from fiction and ghost stories. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this module, it is this: good paranormal investigation is built on a foundation of solid historical research. Investigation teams can have all the EMF meters and night vision cameras in the world, but if they don't understand the documented history of a location, if they're chasing folklore instead of facts, they're just collecting data in a vacuum. That's where we come in. As researchers, we provide the historical foundation that makes their work meaningful. In the next module, we're going to deep dive into why historical context matters so much in paranormal investigations. We'll look at the common historical misconceptions, examine case studies from my interviews with investigation teams, and discuss how understanding the past can completely change the way investigators interpret present day phenomenon. Until then, I encourage you to practice what we've covered today. Pick a reportedly haunted location in your area and start researching. See what primary sources you can find. Reach out to your local historical society. Start building your research toolkit. Thanks for joining me for module 1. I'll see you in the next one.